Well, good morning, everybody. It is a little early here in the U.S., so if what I say makes no sense, we'll just blame it on, the hour. What I wanted to focus on in my response was the part of the report that actually focuses on possible tensions amongst the 7 key requirements, and how those, considering it, those tensions could inform implementation efforts. I thought it was really praiseworthy and important that there was some attention devoted to considering the tensions that could arise in terms of possible sort of conflicts as these various goals are pursued. And as it got me thinking a bit deeper about that, and whether there were some potential tensions that maybe merited even further attention. And it got me thinking in particular about the diversity and fairness requirement, and some of the tensions that not only sort of we've historically recognized around pursuit of diversity objectives in the media space broadly, but also some of the ways in which those tensions have evolved in the contemporary moment that I think are important to keep in mind. So I just want to talk a little bit about past and present on as far as that goes. If we look at the past, right, not that far past, in fact, but just 10, 15 years in the past even. Some of the primary tensions that we used to think about in terms of relationships between diversity and other, traditional media policy objectives were things like the relationship between diversity of sources and viewpoints and efficiencies, right, and the pursuit of economies of scale that would, in theory, benefit consumers, though whether they often did is another question. Sometimes that tension was even framed in terms of a tension between diversity and competition. That is, this idea that we would need to let some sectors grow and become more concentrated and less diverse in order to facilitate sort of cross-sector competition. This was a very common sort of rhetorical sleight of hand, you might argue, here in the U.S. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Also sometimes framed as a tension even between diversity and freedom of speech. That is, efforts to sort of enhance the diversity of sources and viewpoints that are accessible could be interpreted as imposing on the speech rights of individual speakers. So different conceptions of how speech rights should be allocated could often come into conflict with efforts to enhance diversity. But what happened, and again, I'm talking a lot about sort of my own, some of the experiences we had in the U.S., but I think this was more broadly as well, was sort of this widespread adoption in certain policymaking communities that the internet essentially, and we saw this term used quite a bit here, solved the diversity problem. That it essentially facilitated access to diverse content and diverse viewpoints and all of that, diverse sources, to an extent that sort of policymaking interventions were no longer necessary. Whether that is truly the case is obviously debatable, but it also did sort of that changing technological dynamic did introduce new problems, new tensions, we should say. So today, I think when we look at diversity and fairness and things of that sort as a requirement within the context of AI, we have to recognize the ways that can potentially come in conflict with other objectives, accountability, and social environmental well-being, which are some of the other requirements in the report. If you think about the ways in which our contemporary ecosystem can facilitate the dissemination and consumption and access to sources and content without the levels of accountability that for what they are disseminating that we have been used to traditionally. And certainly social and environmental well-being, we can, this is where we get into the realm of concerns, not only about sort of the functioning of the democratic process, which I'll circle back to, but issues around hate speech and those kind of environmental well-being type of issues. And then, of course, more broadly, going beyond the confines of the requirements in the report to issues of trustworthiness and reliability in our sources of news and information. So we look, to the things that we recognize, have, happen and to some degree have facilitated greater diversity, low barriers to entry, access to audiences and the distribution that are facilitated by social media, and the decline of traditional gatekeepers. These have all, are important contributing factors, but they have also, of course, as we know, contributed to increased problems of things like disinformation and hate speech. Obviously we have to recognize those essentially as byproducts of a technological system that, was diversity enhancing. So that's a basic tension. And all this reminded me of some work that a colleague of mine, Sandra Brayman, did 15 years ago for a collection we put together. And she talked about this idea of needing to be careful about fetishizing diversity, which is this idea that sort of the mere accomplishment of diversity objectives would be considered sufficient to an ideal type of participatory governance. And it was just, it was something at the time I remember just sort of storing away in the back of my head. And it was interesting to find myself as I was preparing for this event, suddenly that piece sort of was resonating with me. And I think that's something, it's sort of a useful warning to keep in mind as we think about how best to sort of implement any types of reforms that are directed at improving diversity and fairness and how algorithmic systems and AI operates in this space, right? And I say this from the standpoint of someone who's been working in this space now for 20 plus years. And the phrase I often find myself returning to for those who do, those of us who've done media diversity related research and even advocacy for that long, is be careful what you wish for. And this may make me starting to sound sort of reactionary and cynical at this point, but I think the pendulum, you could argue, really has swung a bit too far the other way. And so as we move forward in trying to figure out how best to sort of reflect desired levels and types and forms of diversity and fairness in how we regulate AI and govern algorithmic systems, well, we want to make sure that we don't over prioritize. And this was not something you would hear me say, and hear the year 2000 me say, diversity within that context. We hear a lot now about constructing sort of content moderation systems, for example, that try to expose people to opposing viewpoints or fair. We're trying to, legislate fairness here in the US, where we can make sure that our social media platforms treat, quote, both sides equally. And that's something as we see as a manifestation of fairness or diversity, et cetera. We, of course, now are very well aware of the dangers of that kind of simplistic approach in this space. And I have a colleague here who's done research on exposure to opposing viewpoints in a lab called the Polarization Lab. And as he has famously said, at this point, the only thing the Polarization Lab has been able to accomplish has been to increase polarization. That in fact, if you reduce this to these notions of providing people with access to opposing points of view, that one of the things that can happen is that it can reinforce existing biases. So just a few thoughts on recognize the complexities that are inherent today in pursuing diversity and fairness goals, and tensions that are inherent in it that we certainly, I think, might not have thought of 15, 20 years ago, but that we have to really put, top of mind today. So I will stop there.
Thanks a lot, Philip. Really this nuanced perspective on what do we need to do, and also referring to the work of Sandra Brayman, I know quite well. It's really nice to hear. And I think the next speaker, Stephen Cave, might want to add to the issue of diversity as knowing what he wants to present. Stephen?
Yes, thank you.